Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. We're just going to give everyone a second to get logged in here and then we'll start. All righty, let's get going. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you guys are today. Thanks for joining us. Today's webinar is co-hosted by the New York Oracle User Group and Oracle partner Viscosity North America. We've got an awesome presenter here with us today. Hopefully many of you recognize Stephen, and also our awesome NYOUG rep Coleman Leviter. Thanks for joining us, guys. This is a live webinar, so please take advantage of the time that you've got with Stephen. Ask him questions in the Q&A field, not the chat, but the Q&A. Also, just a note, today's session is recorded. It will be posted at NYOUG.org. There is no slide deck associated. Y'all are going to get to see a lot of live code and everything awesome from Stephen, so I know you guys always want a slide deck, doesn't exist this time, but you can go back and rewatch today's webinar. So those are pretty much all the house rules I've got for you. I'm going to hand it over to Coleman, who's going to tell you a little bit about NYOUG. Then my colleague Katie will give you a quick intro to Viscosity, and then we'll start today's webinar.
Thank you, Monica. So the New York Oracle Users Group was formed almost 40 years ago for the exchange of ideas, assistance, and support among users of the Oracle software products. We're always looking for abstracts. Feel free to go on our website, NYOUG.org, and look for the location, Call for Abstracts. You can reach us on Twitter, Meetup, and of course the abstracts again, LinkedIn, Facebook, and our website, NYOUG.org. And I wish to thank again Viscosity North America for co-hosting the series of webinars with the New York Oracle Users Group. And I'll just pass it on to Katie for a moment.
Thank you, Coleman. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again so much for joining us today. My name is Katie Barnes. I'm an account manager at Viscosity. Before we get started with the presentation, I just wanted to introduce you guys to Viscosity and give you some information about who we are and what we do. So at Viscosity, we are an Oracle partner. We work very closely with Oracle Product Management, and we now have 6 Oracle ACEs on our team. Many Oracle customers are increasingly relying on professional service partners like ourselves to serve as trusted advisors and help make better purchasing decisions. Our business model at Viscosity is very simple. We work hard to build trusted relationships, and we implement technologies and solutions when the time is right. We're always happy to be a resource to you, whether that be tomorrow, next year, or later down the road. Our areas of expertise fall under 3 pillars: data, apps, and infrastructure. A large bulk of our business is on the database side, including data integration, data warehousing, zero downtime migration to latest versions. And overall, we help improve performance at the database level. In our applications practice, we do a lot of Apex development, EPM, ERP, we develop custom apps. And lastly, our infrastructure and hardware practice includes Oracle's public cloud offering, bare metal, engineered systems. And we were actually named Oracle's ODA Partner of the Year back in 2019. So as you can see here, we're very active within the Oracle community. We do pretty much everything when it comes to Oracle, but these are some of our more broad areas of expertise. The people that you see here on this slide represent some of our leaders at Viscosity and our Oracle ACEs. We have 6 Oracle ACEs now. These guys are amazing. They are frequently presenting webinars for us and user group conferences. They are all wonderful leaders to have within your network and are eager to meet with individuals like yourself. So here are some of our other services, and I'll just briefly go over a few of them. We have experts on Oracle license management that have actually come from Oracle and have worked in that space for several years. We provide all of our customers with knowledge and best practices on how to manage and maximize your Oracle investments. We are probably most known for our zero downtime migrations and upgrade services. We've helped customers migrate from AIX to Linux with zero downtime, and more recently have been helping our customers with upgrading to Oracle 19c. Our performance health checks allows us to fix pain points before they become real problems for our customers. And lastly, we also offer a full stack of DBA services as well. In this slide, I wanted to showcase the work that Viscosity has put into becoming trusted advisors who have actually written the books on Oracle's latest technologies and versions, anything from virtualization, pluggable databases to Oracle Exadata. We offer consulting and strategy meetings to assess all of your current projects, pain points, or team goals, and to share our resources with you, like the books that you see here. So if you are interested in connecting with one of us, please let me know. You can shoot me an email and we'll schedule a time to connect. Alrighty, last slide before I hand it back to Coleman to introduce today's speaker. If you haven't already checked out our events page, please do so using the URL that you see here on this slide. We update this page on a monthly basis with our webinars, workshops, and other great events that we have going on, and it's a really great resource. Just a quick reminder that there will not be a slide deck for this presentation, and the recording will be made available on the NYOUG website at nyoug.org. And with that being said, thanks for listening, and I'll go ahead and pass it back over to Coleman.
Thank you, Katie. I'd like to introduce Stephen Feuerstein, but if you're watching this webinar right now, Stephen needs no introduction at all. So thank you, Viscosity North America, for co-hosting a series of webinars with the New York Oracle Users Group. And Stephen, thank you for appearing and presenting this webinar today. Thank you again.
Very happy to do it, Coleman. Thanks for the intro. Hey, everybody. So yes, my name is Stephen Feuerstein. I've been doing almost nothing but PL SQL professionally since about 1991. Hopefully you'll benefit from my obsession. I kind of have. And so the plan today is no PowerPoint slides whatsoever. Hopefully that does not disappoint too many of you. You can find many, many of my PowerPoint slides all over the place in videos and so on. What I'd like to do is spend some time just taking a look at code, doing a live code review. Some of it will be actual code from projects I've worked on at Insum. Insum Solutions, by the way, is my current employer. I joined them just over a year ago, and I'm helping the largest Apex consultancy in the world do some really great stuff and having a great time. So I'm going to look at some code that we've worked on, but also just some examples I've come across through the years. So let's share my screen and get on going. So I'm in SQL Developer, and let's play around with some code. And by the way, feel free to break in with questions anytime. In fact, Coleman, if you could, feel free to keep an eye on the Q&A and just interrupt me whenever there's a question that you think is good to take right away. I'd appreciate it. Okay, so let's start looking at patterns and anti-patterns in code. And we're going to start off with something very, very simple. It's a procedure to create a user. I'm sure you've all seen code like this or have written something similar. I'm going to pass in the username. And I'm going to see if that person is already a user in my table. And if nobody's found, then I'm going to insert a row. Pretty simple, right? So what I like about small examples like this is we could probably spend a half hour just exploring some of the interesting aspects of this piece of code, but I'll keep it to maybe 5 minutes. Let's see if I can hold your interest doing it. So one of the things that I think are worth doing whenever you're about to start writing a program or you're being asked to review a program is to ask the question, what assumptions am I making about the data, about the database, about my code, about my application as I write this code? Now, what I would say that's going on here is I'm assuming by the way I've written this procedure that most of the time when I am asked to create a user, when this procedure is called, that person will already exist. So what happens if the person already exists? I pass in the username, I find a match, and I don't do anything at all because the user's already created. So if that is your situation, if you're creating a create user procedure and you know that 90% of the time, the person's already going to be there, this is not a bad implementation. But now let's flip it a little bit. Let's suppose that most of the time when create user is called, we're adding a new user. We're constantly getting new users. We expect the user numbers to grow dramatically in the coming years, months, seconds. So what's the problem then? Well, the problem then is that this is often going to raise no data found because it wouldn't find a row. So I'm going to have an exception and then do the insert. Now, I'd say there are two problems with that. First of all, the problem is that exception handling is relatively slow. So if I know I'm going to be missing a row most of the time, I'm paying the price of exception handling, stopping everything, stopping the flow, moving down to the exception section and running that code, which is relatively slow. The second interesting thing about this piece of code, while not critical, still violates what I would consider a good guideline, which is you never put application code inside the exception section. The exception section is for handling errors. And you know what? No data found is not an error. It's a data condition. So I like to keep all my application code out of the exception section. And I like to make sure that the data patterns that I'm going to be running against match or optimize against my code. So let's take this step by step. Let's look at another iteration of create user. Now what I've done is put a begin end around just the select. I trap the no data found, set the ID to null, which I don't even really need to do because it's already null. And then if it's null, I insert. So what's the difference here? My insert is no longer inside the exception handler. It's inside the part of my application code, my executable block. So I think this is better than the first iteration, but still it's assuming that I'm almost always going to be finding someone. Again, that's okay. In fact, if I find someone, yes, then LID is not null. So here's the other approach. Now we're going to flip it around. The other approach would say, well, you know what? Almost all the time. No. So what I could also do is avoid the select into entirely, worrying about raise no data found. And I'm going to assume that most of the time when I call create user, I'm going to be inserting a row successfully. So what I'll do, instead of doing the select into and relying on no data found to be raised, I'll just do an insert and rely on my found index exception. I'll rely on my unique index to flag the fact that it didn't work and handle the exception and then do nothing. So this pattern makes sense if I figure that most of the time I call create user, I'm going to successfully insert a user. And you might say, so hopefully that makes sense to you. And then there's one other thing. I would suggest that whenever you do when anything then null, or whenever you have a null statement in your code, you include a comment to explain why. User already exists, nothing to do. It might be obvious to us as we write the program, even as we're looking at it this way. Of course, it's also a tiny little program. But in the real world, you've got lots of code, lots of pressure, lots of stresses. And people will look at that and say, wait a minute, didn't Tom Kite say that when others then null should never happen in your code, and it may not be others, but it's default, and this is really bad. What do I do about it? No, instead you document the fact that it's okay, we meant to do this. Final thought about this create user procedure, and that's overloading. So one of the other really nice things I think has to do with writing code that is really easy for other developers to use. In other words, we write code, other developers use it. We want to make them feel good about our code and feel good about writing code in the application, is that you want to anticipate the different ways they're going to use the program and then match up your code to those different patterns. So far I've talked about the pattern inside the code matching up to how it's being used. In other words, am I mostly going to be creating a new user or mostly not? But now let's talk about how and when I call the create user program, because a very common pattern is what you see here. I create the user, done. The user's in the database. Another pattern is I create the user and I need the user ID because I'm then going to do something with that new user. But with this kind of create user program, what do I have to do? I have to select from the table after calling create user to get the ID for that name, which is not a great idea. So here's another approach to take my final iteration. I'd say in these kinds of situations with something like create user, and I think you'll find that in a lot of different scenarios, you might consider doing some overloading. So here's my create user procedure. Now it passes in a username and it passes out the user ID. And here's my insert into my table. And I use the returning clause to get the new user ID out and pass it into my out parameter. And if I don't need, if I can insert the row, no problem, do nothing. Then you could say, well, why do I need more than this? Now I've got create user, pass in the username, get the ID, and you can use it if you want or ignore it. But that's the thing. If I don't need the user ID, now I have to declare a variable to hold the user ID coming out. So whenever I have a procedure like this, I'll include an overloading, same name, different parameter list. Overloading is one of the fantastic features of PL SQL in many languages. And what I'll do is declare a local variable, call my create user, and just ignore the fact that I got the ID back. I hide that so I don't have to declare a local variable in the user code that uses create user. And then finally, you might consider having a function, create user, pass in the username, get back the ID. So that would allow you to write code. If create user, this name is not null, then, and so on and so forth. So these are three variations on the same original procedure that I think are helpful, though honestly, in my case, if I was writing this code, I would not create this as an overloading, because that is not the name of a function. The name of a function says, this is what I'm returning. The name of a procedure says, this is what I'm doing. So for this one, I would probably say user ID for name. So if the user ID for the name is not null, it reads a lot more easily, it reads a lot better. I could just say user ID, but I don't know about you, I get nervous and a little bit unsettled when I declare functions and procedures with the same name as columns in the table. It doesn't matter. PL SQL doesn't get confused, but it makes me nervous, so I often just qualify it a little bit like that. Now, I did see a hand go up, so do I have a question that I should take a look at?
You've got 2 questions in Q&A from Suzanne.
Right. Suzanne, nice to hear from you again. Wouldn't it be better to hand off the need to insert to another process entirely? Isn't it good to always use it when others to catch oddball somethings? And what about using merge instead? Okay, so would it be better to hand off the need to insert to another process? I assume, Suzanne, what you're saying is have 2 different procedures, one that just does the insert and one that just does the fetch. I think that's what you're saying. And you can make the argument, but to me, I don't see why we wouldn't combine them. Again, it depends a lot on what the usage patterns are in your application. And in terms of having a general when others, let's go back and take a look at my code. So as you can see here, I've got a trap for dupe val and index, but I don't have a handler for anything else going wrong. And that's a good question. I don't think there's a great single answer. For example, Tom Kite famously had a perspective that you only handle exceptions like when others at the very top level of your stack. So if create user is being called from the front end, you might have a when others. But if it's being called internal to other PL SQL subprograms, you would not put a when others around it, not trap anything. I tend to think that it's important to trap anything going wrong locally so you can grab the data. So let's add that. So I think you're right, and it should be something like this when others. What I want to then do, if I was using logger, I'd say log error, and the main thing I want to pass in is the username. So not to write the whole thing out, but the main thing to me about trapping exceptions right in that local block and not letting it propagate out is I want to grab any input values or any variables that I've computed during that program so I can store them with the error and I can more easily diagnose what went wrong. If I only trap at the highest level in my stack, I've lost all my local application state in the blocks as they close on the way up. So thanks, Suzanne. Really good point. And then Matthias says, what about using merge instead? So I think what you're saying, Matthias, is use merge without an update. So I'm just going to do an insert, but the merge will have the match condition in it. I'm not great with writing merge statements, so I'm not going to try to convert this right now, but I believe what you're basically saying is you don't have to write the select. Well, let's go up to the top. You don't have to write the select, or I guess you do write the where clause in the merge, and then Oracle will check to see if there's a row that matches, and if not, do the insert. So I think that's a fine alternative. I don't do that for 2 reasons. One, as I mentioned before, I don't have a long, deep experience with merge, so I kind of stay away from it a little bit. Which is not a good reason, absolutely not a good reason. The other reason, though, I think is a better one, which is you're not doing an upsert. So a merge is an upsert process. Update if it exists, otherwise insert. And you're not doing that. So to me, I've always felt weird when I look at a merge statement and it doesn't have an update branch, it just has an insert branch. But I don't know that that's a good reason for not using it. That's my reason for not using it. Okay, those are my 2 questions. Answered them both live. Anything else that I should respond to, Coleman, or keep going?
Looks good.
That's
Okay.
good. Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, no problem. All right, so let's take a look at some more code. Now, when I'm looking through people's code, and so what I do a lot at Insum is consultants will write code, and then they'll send them to me, send me a package, 500, 1,000 line package, whatever, and I just cruise down through the package and I look for things that catch my attention and offer suggestions for rewrites. So one of the things I look at always is the declaration section of a procedure or function, or in this case, anonymous block. And the declaration section can often tell you a lot about what you're about to find in the program below, or at least get you all excited about cool stuff you might be able to do in terms of refactoring. So what I see here is a lot of patterns and declarations. You can see the patterns and names, right? Looks like there are up to 7 files, and we've got names for the files. Those aren't the real names. I played around with that. Then we've got an array of lines for each one of the files. Then we've got the count in the file. You can see the pattern over and over, lots of different variables to do something with files. What are we doing? Let's see. Well, here's a little initialization procedure that basically says, initialize all my collections to empty. By the way, if you ever see code like this, you do not need to do that. It's already initialized. No, sorry, this is a nested table. So you do have to initialize it, but I would probably do it right up here. I'm not sure I have a separate procedure for that. So it could be like that. But in any case, that's what that one does. Print lines grabs whatever the lines are that are passed in and write them out to a file, util file. Who uses util file anymore? Very few people. In fact, very few people have used util file for a long time, but now with the cloud, it's really put this to bed mostly. Okay, now we have add a line to this file. So for this file, I want to add a line. And what do? I've got this big case statement that says, well, if the file name is kfile1name, then extend for a new row, put the line in the array, and update the counter. So there's some funny things about this code generally. And again, whenever you look at a piece of code, you're looking at somebody's knowledge of PL SQL, their experience, sometimes their time pressures. You can see here, this is a lot of copy and paste. Also, what we see here is some level of unawareness about collections because I don't have to keep track of the counted elements in my collection. I can use the .count method on this. So that's a little bit strange, but clearly lots of repetition. And then constructing a big full line here. I think there was one of these there was one of these if statements for all 7 files. Anyway, so my question was, how can I crunch things down? How can I avoid all this redundancy and instead express the code via its pattern? Let's take a look at what I did. Well, I still have 7 different file names. That's data, right? That's actual information that I can't lose. So I still have that. But one of the tricks that I found have been really helpful in the work that I do in PL SQL is string index collections. So you can have collections like this one, which is a nested table that is indexed by integer. You can have v-arrays and associative arrays also indexed by integer. But if you have an index by or associative array collection, you can also index by varchar2. Let's take a look at how I can use that technique. All right, so instead of having all this other stuff, so there are my 7 different file names, but notice all this other stuff, it is so totally gone. In its place, I have one array of lines. So this is similar to what you saw before here, but I've added the index by. So now it's just a standard associative array, a list of strings indexed by an integer. And then I have a T files, which is a table of lines. So this is an array of arrays, a nested collection. And this collection is indexed by varchar2. Now that seems a little bit odd. What is that varchar2? Let's make that a little bit more clear. Let's do some coding on the fly. And I'm going to say subtype file name T is varchar2. Let's put this up here. And let's do this. I like block selection in SQL Editor, SQL Developer, and then this here. Now that I like a lot better. Okay, so I've created a new data type in PL SQL. It's actually just an alias for an existing type. But now I've given an application-specific name to a generic type. That means that I can declare it here, which is certainly a fine thing to do. But more importantly, when I'm constructing these nested structures and complex structures, it's really good to get away from hard-coded like PLS integer or number or varchar2 100 to actually say what it is. So now this is a list of files indexed by the file name, and associated with each file name is an array of lines. And this is all the contents across all my files. Now let's see what that does for us. So let's take a look at loading a file. So now instead of having a lot of specific structures like this, I can squeeze the code down further and have it generic across them all. But let's go to add line. I think that's more interesting and more telling. So here's add line before. Lots of copy and paste, lots of duplication, and it all squeezes down to one line. Isn't that sweet? Let's parse it, because it can be hard to read this stuff. L file contents is a collection of collections. Each element in file contents is indexed by the file name. And then within, for that file name, I have a list of lines for that file. So go to this file. This tells us this is a whole collection. And that's the collection here as well. Get the count. So I'm at 100. I'm now going to add it to the end of the array, go to the 101st element in the array, add the line. So all this hard coding of different hard-coded names of variables can be removed because it's all keyed. Even though this is called file one across the board is this. It's actually a string, it's a name. So as long as I have that name, I can build a whole data structure around that name, key to that name, and get rid of all that redundant code. Let's see what else I can show you here about this one. I think that's the main thing I want to get across, and we can keep moving through other examples. But so one thing to keep in mind is when you see this kind of redundancy, there are often a number of ways to get around it. I'm going to look at another example in a moment, which involves dynamic SQL. But you'll find string indexing to be often a really sweet way to soft code the logic in your program without losing any of that specificity, of course. Now, I want to say one more thing about this kind of coding, because you might look at this and say, oh, wow, seriously? You're going to do a lot of copying and pasting? Now, you might say that to yourself now, but of course, when you're in the middle of a lot of pressure, you're feeling to yourself, I know I could do better. I know it shouldn't be like this, but I'm just going to do copy, paste, get through it, and then I'll fix it sometime in the future. That, of course, often never comes. But the point I want to make here is that this is not a bad way to build the first iteration of your program. So you're handed a technical specifications document, and it's very detailed, and there's a lot to go through, and of course, you're under a lot of pressure. So what you generally will do is kind of translate as directly as you can the technical specs to your code. And what that often means is you don't have time to be clever and think about a lot of interesting architectural aspects. You want to make sure that the logic in the technical specs is accurately represented in the code. So boom, there it is, in all its glory for everybody to see. You get your code to work. And then what you should do is come back and say, how can I get rid of these redundancies? How can I express this pattern? So this becomes essentially the second iteration of your approach to writing the program. Because I have a lot of experience with string index collections and a lot of experience with this kind of code, for me, I probably would never do that. I would never write code like this to start, because I've already got that technique deeply embedded in my head. But for those of you who haven't already used this a lot, you might not realize you can do it. Don't stress too much about writing code like this, as long as you make time to either look for alternatives or even ask a coworker to come in and help you think about refashioning it, refactoring it. Questions? We're good?
I think you've got a few, actually.
Okay. Yes, I do. Why not turn on intra-unit inlining for create user procedure? So Lakshman, if I understand you correctly, what I think you're saying is set your optimization level to 3 in PL SQL. So let's take a look at that, and I'll come back to the other questions. When you install Oracle database, your optimization level is automatically set to 2. That's the default, and that's a really excellent optimization level. Never move it down to 1 or 0. But as of 11G, Oracle added a third optimization level called number 3, level 3. And the PL SQL team recommends that you should always up your optimization level to level 3. It can be reduced, but it can be set at the database level to 3, and it's recommended that you do that. Now, there's only one specific optimization added with level 3, which is inlining. So level 3 gives you inlining. And what that essentially means is that when a function is called inside a program, at the time of compilation, the code inside F2, which obviously is not very much right now, but the code inside that function is actually put in place of the function call. Literally, it looks like this. Obviously not literally exactly like this, because this wouldn't really make a whole lot of sense. Wouldn't pass true to it. But the point is that it inlines all the code from your sub-programs. Why would it do this? Well, when you're in runtime, if you don't have inlining optimized, then as soon as the runtime engine hits the call to F2, there's a slight pause. It goes and looks up the code for F2 and runs it. So inlining avoids that slight overhead of basically finding the code for the function or procedure invocation. In most of the programs you write, you probably never notice the difference, but why not go ahead and give the compiler more of an opportunity to do more optimization? In some cases, it could be significant. And so Lakshman asked that question in the context of create user. So the question is, why not turn on inlining for these programs? So here's an example of inlining that could help. But I'd say in this case, Lakshman, really very little benefit to be achieved. More questions. What is used in the cloud instead of util-file? Well, then, so I don't know how to answer that really well, Bonnie, because I'm not a cloud person, and certainly not an OCI, Oracle Cloud infrastructure person. But in general, you're going to be using, what are they called? Cloud objects or shared objects. So they're objects inside the cloud that you can then move around. And I'm sure you can write them out as files. You just wouldn't use util-file. But sorry, I don't have more details on that. Is there any sample database in Oracle to practice, and where can we download it? Well, Sam, I've got some news for you. So if you're looking for a place to play around with Oracle database, and you don't want to have to bother installing it, what you want to do is go to livesql.oracle.com, or you can get your cloud database for free. But LiveSQL is a place where you can go and sign in, and you can run SQL, you can learn SQL and PL SQL, and there's an enormous library of scripts. I've got probably about 275 PL SQL scripts alone, and there's lots more. So check out LiveSQL for a place to go if you need to play around with SQL and PL SQL and don't have access to a database. Are the arrays that you refer to in the procs actually cursors? No. So a cursor is a pointer to a data set in the database, rows and columns in the database, or in a set of tables, however you want to describe it. Collections are in-memory data structures. You think of collections as tables, which is why, oddly enough, let's go back to the syntax. If you look at the way that these things are declared, they're called is table of. And that actually harkens back to the very first implementation of collections in PL SQL back in Oracle 7. The only kind that was supported were the index bys, and they were called PL SQL tables. So they can look a lot like and act a fair amount like relational tables, but they're in memory. There are some exceptions to that. You can store these collections as columns and tables, but I'm not going to get into that now. So in-memory collections, but there's no pointer, there's no cursor pointer back to a data set. They are programmatic structures that you can work with, and they're super fast to manipulate. I think that does it. I'll answer them all. Mark them all as answered. All right, back I go. And I'm already sharing. So let's take a look at so now what I want to do is take a look at another program from a different perspective, which is not so much, let's look at the declaration section, but let's look at this endless procedure. And unfortunately, it looks like SQL developers resetting my connection. So let's, do I want to avoid that? I hate to wait. Let's get going. Yes, I want SQL. Have you connected yet? Oh, you're so slow. Okay, yep, now it's set. So first of all, I'm going to reformat my code. I don't know how many of you know, but for years I have famously promoted using uppercase for keywords and lowercase for non-keywords. It's the way I learned, I think, originally from Oracle and just decided to like it. I joined Insum and lots of people hate it. Okay, that's all right. I joined Insum and the standard at Insum is all lowercase. So I now do that. So now I've made it all lowercase. So what I'm going to do is show you this procedure called intab. Let's compile it. Okay, really? Oh, right, not SP. We're getting there, folks. We're getting there. There we go. Format, save, set, compile. Let's try it out. Do I have my temp file here? No. Let's show you what it's supposed to be. So intab, so this is a procedure called intab, and it basically is like select star from table. So watch, show me everything in departments. There it is. Show me everything in the employees table. Oh, wow. Now, if we were in a, together in a classroom together, I would like to think that you're all like gasping with joy, not at the fact that it could take departments and display it, take employees and display it, but look how nicely formatted it is. If you've ever done any kind of report formatting in PL SQL, it's a pain. So there you go. I made it look pretty. But that's what intab does. It's basically a select star from table. Obviously, you can pass it any table name. So I must be doing something dynamic. I am. So what I did was build the intab utility, in-table utility, using DBMS SQL. This is a dynamic SQL method for challenge. It's the most complex kind of dynamic SQL because I don't know how many columns I'm fetching from the table, since the table could be any table. So what I could do, look at that, look at all that commenting. I love it. Here are my declarations. They don't look so bad. Okay, got some sub-programs, but here's the beginning. So here's my main block of code. Let's just kind of take a stroll. I've got some comments explaining what I'm doing, separate the schema and table names, get all the column information using a bulk collect retrieval. That looks good. Stop if there's nothing in my collection. And then I'm going to iterate through all my columns. And it looks like I'm going to come up with lengths of my data and this, that, and the other, construct my array, construct my where clause, build my query. There's my big, gigantic select statement, parse it. Then I have to iterate through every element that I fetch. And oh no, this is before I run it. I have to define each individual column as a number, data, whatever, number, date, timestamp, etc. And then finally, I can loop fetching rows, get my data back. Then I have to say what kind of value it is, get it back to a local variable, then display the right local variable. And in the end, construct one big row and then display that string. So hopefully you can see what I just did. I talked through the code. You could probably talk your way through the code somewhat similarly if you were familiar with Dynamic SQL Method 4 and DBMS SQL and you had some comments. That's great, but I got to say that once again, this is the sort of thing that I'd like to see as a first round iteration of a piece of code. In other words, I've really got to think through the algorithm. So I'm going to take it step by step. First I do that, then I do this, then I do that. And I lay it all out in my procedure. That way I feel like I'm writing the code and I'm covering all the bases. But afterwards, to maintain this, not a lot of fun. And for somebody else to come in and make heads and tails of it, even less fun. So my feeling is that in general, even if you want to write these big procedures as a first pass, what you should end up with, and ideally start with instead, is what I would call a sort of top-down design approach. So here's my refactored version of intab. Now I'm going to go down to the main block. In fact, let's put main block. Let's put that in as a little tag, because that is often helpful. So there, these are both the main block. But look, my main block is now 5 lines long, and you can read it. It's now a table of contents. It's basically saying, all right, First, we're going to load the column information. Then we're going to construct and parse the query, define the columns and execute, build and display the output, and then clean up when I'm done. Now, anybody can read and understand that, but where did all the code go? Well, what happened is that I went through this original version and I literally said, okay, what is this doing? I want to get this name, so we don't have to type it. So the first thing I need to do is get all the column information and load it up. So I'm going to grab the columns. I'm going to paste that there. Then I'm going to grab all of this. And I'm going to move it up here. Add an end statement. Add an is. Get rid of the stuff down here. Reformat. And now I've got all this code to load a column. Oh, it looks like it didn't format. We need to begin. Let's do that again, because I like my code to be pretty and properly indented. So there it is. There's load column information. And I can even say, I don't want to see the details. Isn't that nice? And there it is, load column information. Then I can take the next one. So what I can do is go through my code and ask myself, after I read 20, 30 lines, can I describe what this body of code does? If I can describe it, I can name it. If I can name it, pull it out, create it as a nested subprogram in the same procedure, and replace it with the name. And then you end up with code that is much easier to read and much easier for people to maintain. It's a little bit odd because the bulk of the code is above the main block of code, right? So I have to kind of squeeze around now in SQL Developer. Let's see if this works. I don't know if I can find the right keys to press. No. At least in Windows, that was it, wasn't it? You could click down, hold the key and click down, and it would take you to that procedure. Now it froze. Maybe it's working. Okay. In some of the different editors you've got, you can actually move around through your nested subprograms and their invocations pretty easily. I'm actually not sure what SQL Developer is doing right at this moment. But this, I think, is one of the most important refactorings you can do. Yes, reconnecting. Okay, let me try that one more time. Huh. So it's telling it it can't find it. Did I name it wrong? No, it's right there. So I don't know what's going on with SQL Developer in that case. But as you can see, all my main programs, the real bulk of my big complex package is now a series of these nested subprograms, which I can also squeeze down so I can focus on other aspects when I'm working on these big programs. So the main thing is you don't want to get confused by a lot of detailed logic that just goes on and on and on, and you get lost. You want to keep your subprograms, your main body of code in any main executable section, really small and readable. I think it's the best single piece of advice I can give you about writing code. Even inside this procedure, I might have some other procedures, and just keep on applying the same rule, which is no more than 20 or 30 lines of code in the main body of an executable section. So that, I think, can take you a long way in terms of coming up with code that is easy to maintain, easy for other people to read, easy to make it your legacy at an organization, one that's very positive. People will look back on you and say, oh, I remember when Stephen worked here. He wrote such nice code, as opposed to, yeah, I remember when Stephen worked here. I'm glad he left because I can't maintain any of his code. So do the right thing. Use a lot of nested subprograms. Avoid these endless main execution sections, and everybody will thank you. Okay. Now let's take a look at another example of some code that I took a look at in Insum. This is a part of a utility called ODTUG at Insum. We build a lot of utilities to accelerate our development and also to offer to our customers. So this has to do with Oracle Apex authentications. And well, there we go. Patterns. We've got 9, 10, we've got 30 maps, whatever the heck those are. We've got 30 attributes. Do we have any more of those? No. So 2 sets of 30. Now, for those of you familiar with Apex, there's something called Apex collections, which are different from Oracle PL SQL collections. There's a PL SQL API around memory structure that Oracle Apex maintains. And there are up to 30 columns in Apex collections. So right away, anybody who's worked with Apex for a while would say, oh, he's using Apex collections. And in fact, if we search for, we don't find Apex collections. So maybe he's doing something else. But, or maybe I pulled that part of the code out. This is just a part of the whole procedure. Okay, but clearly there's something really interesting going on because we've got all this redundancy. Let's take a look. So I just kind of scroll on through the code. There, by the way, is create user. So the code that I was showing you before about create user came out of auth-z as well. And what he's going to do then for each one of these different values, he's going to call get environmental variable to get that information out of the runtime environment of Apex and set it locally. And you can see they're assigned to each one depending on their attribute. And then we're going to go through and retrieve. So this is an internal array in JSON. So this is for JSON manipulation called gvalues. And he's basically retrieving information from the JSON API in Apex and then setting values appropriately. So if the index is fnmap, that's the first name. If it's lnmap, that's the last name. So we have to go to the right. So the index basically tells you which one you're on. And you can see all these different values are set. And then if lindex is attribute1 map, attribute 1, 2, 3. Now at first glance, when you see code like this, you've got to think to yourself, well, what can I do about it? I've got different variable names. So how can I soft code that? Maybe there's a possibility of a string indexing that would help here, but I've still got all these different calls to Apex JSON gvalues to get environmental variable. In this case, what I found is that I could use dynamic PL SQL and get rid of a lot of the redundant code. So let's take a look at the after here. So notice no more 30 attributes, no more 30 attribute maps, 30 attributes. Now what I've got is the groups map. Let's see what I've got here. What did I add? All right, did I just take them away entirely because I'm using dynamic SQL? No, there we go. Is that right? Yeah. So what I did in this case was instead of having a lot of individual variables, I have an array. This is an array of strings, so I just got kind of lazy. And I'm just, instead of creating my own collection of varchar2 indexed by PLS integer, I've just used an existing one for my attribute map and my attributes. And then, skip that for a moment. Remember the get environmental variable code right here. Some of it I couldn't really do much about and stays unchanged. But everything else, take a look at how I could use dynamic PL SQL here. So in this case, I'm going to execute this statement dynamically. I'm going to use as the out the variable value, the location in the array, the nth element in the array. And then the attribute name is tagged in as well. So all this code here could be replaced with one dynamic PL SQL loop of assignments. And then as well, instead of having all these different assignments with JSON gvalues, like this, I could also switch that to dynamic PL SQL to do another assignment. Okay. So I was able to get rid of a lot of hard coding and repetition, in this case, not by using a string index collection, but by using dynamic PL SQL. So you've got a few different options for resolving redundancies, and it very much depends on the situation you're looking at. I don't think I've got a good guideline to follow, like which one should it be, dynamic PL SQL or SQL? Should it be string index collections? It really has to do with very much the context you're looking at, the kind of code you're writing or want to write. Okay? But there are some tremendous opportunities to greatly squeeze things down. Okay, let's see, it's 12:50. Let's see if I've got some questions. Oh, some new ones or no? These are the ones I've already done. Okay.
You've got just one, I think, at the bottom.
Great question, right? Suzanne, not to be rude, but do people really write code with those repeating lines? Well, Suzanne, I guess you haven't, and that makes you a really fantastic developer. So yeah, sure, this is very common. I see it a lot in a variety of different ways. And again, it's often got to do with either a lack of awareness about what's possible in PL SQL Like, what can I do about it, right? I've got different variable names. How can I make that dynamic? And a part of it has to do with, I think, the pressures and not being sufficiently creative or having the time to be creative about how you write code. Sometimes it's simply a matter of the attitude that developer has towards their code. So I tend to be pretty obsessive and compulsive. I constantly reformat my code, and I always use automatic formatting. The SQL Developer formatter is pretty good. It's gotten a lot better, and Travadis offers a set of formatting files that you should use if you're going to use SQL Developer formatting, because out of the box, it doesn't work very well. Toad formatting remains the absolute pinnacle of code formatting that I've ever seen. So I do a lot of auto formatting, make changes, reformat, make changes, reformat, constantly looking for ways to avoid redundancies in code. Sometimes you can overdo it, but most of the time I think it's time well spent. But again, it really is, I think a lot of it is your personality and how much you're committed to writing elegant code, like a piece of art or something that expresses you individually, as opposed to just getting the job done. And by the way, if you just want to get the job done and go home, and even if it's not optimal, it has some redundancies, you don't care because it gets the job done, sure, go ahead. That's perfectly fine. Not all of us have the inclination or the time to make it elegant. Okay, I think I have another question coming in. What is your preferred version of SQL Developer? The latest one. I try to stay pretty current. They're almost always fixing things. So I don't know how to answer that, Mike, except for I just try to stay current. And now I'm going to head over to the chat because there are some questions around Toad, I think, there too. Right. Is it possible to share samples? I'll show you where I can get a whole lot of, you can get a whole lot of my code. Mark is asking me, do I still use Toad? I love Toad. So I used Toad exclusively for so many years, right up until I rejoined Oracle in March of 2014. And at that point, folks, I got to tell you, there's not a lot of interest at Oracle Corporation in buying licenses to Toad. And SQL Developer has come a long, long way. It's a really great tool. So I immediately switched over to SQL Developer. Didn't really have much trouble, maybe a couple of days of, oh, the UI is different, the flow's different. What I missed most moving to SQL Developer was the formatter. Toad's formatter is just almost beyond belief. It's a really incredible piece of software. I know the guy who wrote it, and quite a rocket scientist when it comes to coding. So I loved code, but it was time to move on. So Alex is asking, is it possible to share samples for learning? So let me just talk a little bit about where you can get code. I've already shown you live SQL. Let's go back there for a moment. I had to turn off my keyboard because my dog's lying on it, but sorry, Moonbeam, got to turn it back on. You're gonna have to back up, back way off. Okay, so live SQL, again, has tremendous amounts of code in it. And you can just search for things like bulk collect, and you'll find scripts. You could search for overloading. Oh. Why doesn't it know what I'm talking about? And find lots, just endless amounts of really great information here. In addition, there are things called tutorials, not individual scripts. And these are in-depth explorations of various aspects of Oracle technology and PL SQL. A lot of them correspond to DevGym classes. So another place to get really great content for free is the DevGym. The DevGym offers quizzes, workouts, and classes. It's a website I originally started in 2010 and brought into Oracle, and have now left it behind. But it's currently being actively developed by my son, Eli Feuerstein. So proud of that guy. And if you go to stephenfeuerstein.com, of course, we've all gone to many times today already. Right down here in my little Oracle PL SQL section, you can download a demo zip file that has about 2,000 files, pretty much a collection of all the stuff I've been building and writing and collecting over the years. Stop, Moonbeam, stop. And then most of the files that I showed you will actually be in there. But really, live SQL is probably the best current place to go to see at least my scripts and samples. Okay, do we have anything else? So other questions, comments? And it can be about anything having to do with PLC. Well, it can be about anything. I've got opinions about most things, but you probably don't want to hear my opinions unless it's about PL SQL. Any questions, comments? Any code you want to show me? We can do a little bit more live code review with your code. So yes, the recording will be available at NYOUG.org. And I assume that might even tweet about it and send out an email. And okay. Questions, comments? Is it possible to do a training session on using SQL Developer debugging? Well, that's a good question at NYOUG. I couldn't help you with that because I've never done it. I know, right? I don't use the SQL inline debugger, SQL Developer debugger, and I really should. But I bet Jeff Smith would be happy to present and demonstrate that to you. How different is SQL Developer Web? So there's a version of SQL Developer on the web. I believe it's called Oracle Developer Actions. It's associated with, I think it's only available through the cloud. And it's catching up. I think there's still a lot you can do in SQL Developer you can't do on the web. But I'm pretty sure all the majority of their current and future development work will be on the Developer Actions tool, less so the desktop tool as everybody's moving wholesale to the cloud. Other questions?
Looks like you have some in the Q&A box.
Back to Q&A. Thank you. Preferred version I answered. So Suzanne says, I just habitually write formatted code. Maybe I will try using SQL Developer again. I hate hand format. I mean, I admire that greatly, Suzanne, and I know a number of people who do it. Bryn Llewellyn, who used to be the PL SQL product manager, would hand format all of his code, and he was even more meticulous than I am. But I just can't bear it in terms of the time it takes. And so the auto formatting, once it got to where I could use it well inside SQL Developer, I started using it. Actually, when I first rejoined Oracle back in 2014, I did get permission from the Quest team to still use Toad, my licensed version. But I would use SQL Developer, and if I had to do any heavy formatting, I would copy it into Toad format, copy it back. But again, Travadis has published a number of files. Just look for Travadis SQL Developer formatting, and you can download 2 different files from Travadis, install them into SQL Developer, and it'll format code to match the Travadis coding standards, which we follow at Insum, more or less. So that'll give you the, I think, really make it possible for you to just, write your code however you feel like it, quick keystroke, reformat, write your code however you feel like it. I think it's much more productive. Okay, can we have an example of nested begin and commit handle within it? I'm not exactly sure what that means, Anonymous. So if you'd like to clarify a little bit, that would be great. Nested begin. So in general, what I was taught, if this has to do with the nesting I was referencing earlier, let's take a look at this in-tab program again. So to be really clear, when you're inside any given procedure or function, it could be in a package, in an anonymous block, in another procedure, anywhere along here, I can create other sub-programs that have their own begins. So there's the begin for this procedure, but I could say, construct query. I can even spell it. So at any point, I could just come in here and do it again and again and again, constantly go through my code and refactor it to reduce the number of lines in any specific block of code. And you can see, is begin. Didn't I format this? Wow, something's wrong there. But of course, as you change your code, you got to make sure it's still valid. So I'm not sure what I did. We won't worry about it right now. But that way you can have certainly begins within begins within begins. A commit anywhere inside these nested subprograms is still a commit inside your session. So just because they're in nested subprogram units doesn't have anything to do with the SQL context in your session. A commit will cut across all of them unless it's an autonomous transaction. So hopefully that.
Stephen, I just noticed, were you meaning to share your screen?
No, I just wanted to talk blindly to you all. There's Zoom. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I was sharing my screen. I'm sure I was. I won't go back over it. You can have procedures within procedures within procedures. Trust me. Ravi asked, is there a PL SQL code generator available to download? Well, Ravi, I could tell many stories about that. In terms of a general code generator, I don't think so. I built one ages ago. It had the weirdest name ever. It was called QNXO, quality in, excellence out. And it actually had a templating language. It was sort of like my own markup language, and you could describe the code you wanted to generate based on a table or another data structure, and it would explode out whatever code you wanted. That was fun, but nobody wanted it. So there are a variety of different places you can get code generators. I actually have a lot of code generators in my demo zip, and also Live SQL will often have generators in them. But I don't think there's one particular place. Let me maybe ask back Ravi if you're still around. Is there a specific type of code you're looking to generate? And also in Oracle Apex, you can generate APIs, PL SQL package APIs on top of tables that do a lot of work for you in terms of ensuring or avoiding lost updates. So you might want to take a look at that. All right, well, that's the top of the hour. Thanks for all the questions, interesting comments. It was really fun. I hope you enjoyed it as well. And I just encourage you to stay safe in these difficult, crazy times. Even if a judge lifts a mask mandate, it doesn't mean that you have to leave your mask off. I'm flying to Florida to see my mom soon, and I'm definitely wearing my mask, real N95 all the way through, because the coronavirus is not done with us yet. All right, thanks so much, everybody. Take care.
Thank you, Stephen.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, NYOUG. We will see you all back here again soon. Check out NYOUG.org again for this recorded webinar. Give us a little bit of time to get it up there, but it will be there. Till then, we'll see you later.